Essay poetry. Definition of poetry has always been a ticklish job as difficult as the task of defining life. It escapes analysis just as life escapes the scalpels of the anatomist. Some would connect poetry with the emotions and passions, others with the imagination, others with speech intoning itself in rhythm and music, other again with a sort of mysterious creative urge. Some place greater emphasis on the formal aspect, others on the inner content. But all this merely skirts the limits without striking at the center. Any further attempt in this direction, therefore, is likely to lead to the same unsatisfactory result and leave us suspended in the uncertain regions of some tentative hypothesis. And yet, perhaps because of this very absence of certainty, the subject has a perpetual attraction, and the process of getting to the heart of the matter by analysis has always been a fascinating exercise. Let us start from the beginning. The point of origin. Poetry is one of the branches of the arts. It is coeval with music, painting, sculpture, etc. It has therefore to be made, to be formed and molded. That is why the Greeks called the poet the maker. The task of a maker involves two processes that are so near simultaneous as to make them almost identical. These are first the reception of impressions by senses and then passing them on to the purer mind, and secondly transformation of impressions so received into formal expression. The first is an inner process, the second is its outer projections. The first concern the poet alone and is therefore the formative stage which doesn't concern others immediately. When we speak of a mute, inglorious poet, we mean one who is at the first stage of poetic experience, the stage of mental receptivity. It is the second that concerns the world, the outer expression that we call the art of poetry. Impressions are the effects produced on the mind by external objects. All minds are sensitive to external things. The process is continuous but of varying intensity according to the degree of mental sensitivity. Some pass away, some are retained in memory, others give rise to a new emotions or ideas. Thus, the mind receives images and formulates emotion and ideas their form. This habit or function of the mind is universal, but Wordsworth claims a special privilege or distinction for the poet. He says that the poet's mind is more sensitive than that of an ordinary man, in that it has greater sensibility or proneness to receive sensations. Perhaps it is the this greater sensitivity that urges the poet to creative expression. It is that makes him eager to communicate his impressions to others, to the externalize them in forms that may be experienced and enjoyed by others. The poet, having received an impression of something striking or stirring, is moved to the task of communicating them to others. The emotions is so powerful that it overflows almost instinctively into expression. This may be regarded as the origin of poetry, this desire to communicate one's mental impressions under the stimulus of an intense sensibility. The poet reception of experience is, of course, conditioned by the social milieu in which he lives and forms and from which he draws his substance. His mind reflects his age and environment. He is not an isolated being, but a social entity, and so his reaction to his objective conditions is ultimately social. When his attitude to society is hostile or apathetic, he naturally favors those elements that urge him to hostility or apathy. With his attitude is responsible, when his attitude is responsible and sympathetic, his mind reacts in a similar manner. This is why Arnold called poetry a criticism of life. Poetry is a continuous record of the critical reactions produced on the poet by his epoch or environment. In giving the expression to an image or an idea, the poet has to give it a form. An image or any idea may be defined as a unified series of continuous impressions received by the mind in its constant contact or association with the objective world. By themselves, these are too fluid or mercurial to be capable of molding themselves into form or design. To organize this into form, this is the function of art. Here comes the role of imagination, which Coleridge rightly called the plastic power, the power to mold and shape. Imagination compacts the detached impressions and fuses them and gives them a definite embodiment. And to quote Shakespeare, as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to a shape and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. This it is interesting to note that meticulous accuracy of Shakespeare imagination is not an organ of mere reproduction, of copying or imitating impressions in the precise form in which they were received by the poet. It is a creative power out of the fleeting or airy impressions received by the mind and the senses from the external world. It creates original forms, forms of the things unknown. It organizes ideas an impression to into original forms. So far, this process of mental creation may be said to be common to all the arts. Let us know now examine the process involved in the art of poetry. The poet receives his impressions through his senses and they affect his mind in a peculiar way, bringing into it all manners of thrilling excitements. The ordinary man may be similarly excited, but the excitement subsides and is merged into succeeding or collateral experiences that accompany or follow. For the poet, however, this mental excitement is so intense that it transcends its immediate limit and assumes a certain character or quality, which is really the urge of verbal communication. It must somehow formulate itself in speech symbols for its own proper fulfillment as well as for conveying itself to others, to make others feel its quality in the precise manner that the poet had felt it. Thus, the urge towards communication is of essence of poetic inspiration. Of course, this urge in a crude form is present in every human being who, however, is content to render it in broad outlines, but to the poet it comes with a certain quality of its own. The poet does not merely seek to paraphrase his experience, but to convey it, its totality as it is experienced by himself. And since the experience must, in its nature, be always intensely personal and distinctive in character, the medium of communication must also preserve this personal quality or flavor. Hence, through though the poet uses the words of ordinary speech, his language can never be the abstract, generalized language of the speech. This is why the poet has to be selective in his vocabulary, choosing those special speech forms conservated by uses which not merely symbolize but suggest, which have in fact taken a certain added significance, have received a sort of mystic consideration, consecration through past uses and poetic association. This selective is controlled by the character or class of experience that is to be communicated. This accounts for the stylistic variation in the poetry of different epochs or classes. The style is further individualized by the use of rhetorical figures of the speech as well as by subtle adjustment of sound to sense. Here, the poet is a maker, a bricklayer who chooses his speech symbols carefully, considering their verbal meanings as well as their total quality and putting them together so as to approach the shape of the impression that is in his mind. Of course, The poetic expression is a complex process. An experience is not static but is something vital and expansive. It works in the mind of the poet and propagates new ideas and creates new images and induces fresh emotional states. All these ideas and images and emotions fused and integrated into an organic whole becomes the things that we call poetry. It achieves this final shape not mechanically but as a result of vital emotional process in which the senses and intellect, intuition, memory, and imagination act together in spontaneous cooperation. Thank you.